Welcome to Hermetic Journeys. I'm your host, Tony G. Hey, thanks for tuning in. This is the final part of my series on my trip to Egypt, part 4. And in this video, we're going to focus on the Temple of Luxor. We're going to go over it from top to bottom. Before we delve into the astonishing symbolic nature of the Temple of Luxor, I'd like to take a look at the Symbolist Theory as derived from the Temple of Luxor and how Renee tried to understand ancient Egyptian culture so we can come to a better understanding of the intent and purpose of this magnificent edifice. As John Anthony West so eloquently puts it, he always does, the whole of Egyptian civilization was based upon a complete and precise understanding of universal concepts, and this profound understanding manifested itself in a consistent, coherent, and interrelated system that fused science, art, and religion into a single organic unity. As an example, when we call the deities of Egypt gods, we're seeing this through the lens of the ancient Greeks. Now, the ancient Greeks didn't really understand the abstract and complex nature of Egyptian deities. They didn't really get it. And they applied what they understood to be gods to the ancient Egyptians. So what we have is something that's been filtered down and is erroneous. Okay, it's not a true understanding of it. And when I went to school, we were taught that the ancient Egyptians were primitive people who worship pagan gods, and I hate that expression. Primitive people? Go ahead and try to build a pyramid like the Great Pyramid at Giza, right? Good luck with that. Now, I've been referring to these entities as gods in previous videos, but secretly I've been cringing because that's not what they are. That's not even the proper nomenclature for these entities, right? They're called netters by the ancient Egyptians. The parts of the body were, in a general way, consecrated to the netters or the divine principles. What does that mean? What is a divine principle? Well, something like breathing, the act of breathing, the growth, right? Gestation, those things were considered to be cosmic principles. They were sacred. They were functions, right? So they weren't gods, they were functions. This means the function symbolized by the netter was corporified in that part of the human body. Essentially, the ancient Egyptians perceived divine attributes within human beings and raised them to the level of what we would consider to be the gods, or the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks. In fact, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans reversed that. They imbued the gods with human-like behavior, or misbehavior as the case may be. Zeus. One more thing. It's important to understand that the netters involved with creation, who operated within the cosmic realm, were always depicted in a fully realized human form, like the netter Hallmun, who we're going to meet shortly. Now, the netters who were identified with functions within the human body were typically depicted as in animal form, and we're going to explore that shortly as well. Not to confuse things, but netters who had a human body and an animal head, and you've seen lots of that kind of thing, right, in Egyptian iconography, those are considered to be divine aspects operating within the earthly realm. Nevertheless, all three types of netters had one thing in common. They represented movement. The netters were functions. They were not gods like the ancient Romans and Greeks perceived them. They were cosmic functions and principles. So to further clarify this, let's look at some examples which I hope will provide a greater understanding of how ancient Egyptians conceptualized the netters through their ideology. So let's take a look at some detailed examples that I hope will give us a clearer understanding of the symbolist philosophy, okay? Let's take a look at the serpent, for example, okay? We need to kind of get into the mind of an ancient Egyptian. We need to think like an Egyptian. I mean, it's okay to walk like an Egyptian, like the Bengals say, right? But we really need to think like an ancient Egyptian to figure out what's going on here. Now, in ancient Egypt, the serpent was a symbol of duality, and more to the point, the energies that manifested from that duality. In other words, duality is both, in and of itself, creative and destructive. Creative in a sense that our world is created through duality. Think about it. You can't have day without night, hot without cold, male without female, right? All of these things, these complementary polarities, are responsible for the creation of this universe. In order to have duality, unity needs to be ruptured. Absolute unity, in becoming conscious of itself, creates multiplicity or polarities. One becomes two. This is known esoterically as the primordial scission. Unity is the source from which all duality comes, in fact, from which all things come. But as we will soon see, the golden ratio lies at the heart of this primordial scission, creating a universe that is asymmetric and cyclical, while simultaneously creating the unique proportions within the Temple of Luxor. When people have those near-death experiences, they're talking about becoming part of this light. They see this light, they're drawn towards it, and once they're there, they become one with the light. They become one with unity. Renee says here in the Temple of Man, we allow only divine man, Adamic man, before his fall into nature to remain. He will no longer be able to understand anything by merging or identifying with the creative unity, but only by the comparison of complementaries, right? Once humanity leaves unity, moves from spirit to form, that is, and metaphorically is expelled from the unity of Eden, if you will, we are trapped within this world of duality and polarities. Why? Because it is the adoption of ego and comparative reasoning through the two hemispheres of the brain. More on this later. So how does the physicality of the serpent represent duality? I mean, it's one creature, right? It doesn't have two heads, okay? Interestingly, if we look very closely at the serpent, and this is stuff I didn't know about the serpent either, well, obviously, we all know it has a forked tongue, right? Well, right? Two tongues, sort of, right? And in the male, there are two penises. Penii? I mean, I can't even imagine what that's like. I mean, dealing with one is enough. In any case, and in the female, two uteruses. Uteri, I suppose, right? And beyond that, it sheds its skin. So that's almost like death and resurrection. It's resurrected from its former skin, okay? So you can see why the Egyptians chose this animal. They chose it so wisely because it is literally a symbol of duality. And that's how we're beginning to think like an Egyptian, like an ancient Egyptian, I should say, okay? Here in this magnificent crown, the diadem of Tutankhamun, which comes from his tomb, of course, we see the serpent dividing the two hemispheres of the brain, thus demonstrating that it is the nectar of duality working within our consciousness. So the serpent, in this case, and you can see it beautifully here in this incredible crown, is literally dividing the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. So we see there in and of itself is duality. The choice of these images creates what John Anthony West calls a rich and powerful symbol of the serpent, for duality divulges both a total understanding of the many aspects of duality in both its creative and destructive senses, and an equally complete understanding of the nature of the animal chosen to represent these concepts. That's exactly what I've been talking about for the past few minutes, okay? I believe that's why the serpent in the Garden of Eden, I guess we're here, was in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But I think good and evil were there to give us perhaps a more profound concept concerning this idea. What I'm suggesting here is that Adam and Eve were offered this forbidden fruit, which technically is a representation of creation itself. A tree that grows a fruit that has a seed in it, that plant a seed that grows a tree that has a fruit that has a seed in it. This concept of endless creation, right? The genius of God's creation. And I believe that Adam and Eve didn't recognize that they were naked and therefore ashamed, right? They're always trying to make us feel bad about that stuff, right? I believe they recognized that they were polarities. They were different. They were unique, right? Man and woman, okay? They were polarities. And the serpent, as we now know, is the perfect representation of duality, had to be in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because the knowledge of good and evil are what? They're polarities, right? Here we go again. I know you're gonna get sick of hearing this word polarities. This was the epiphany that polarities can only exist in the realm of three dimensions, all right? Polarities cannot exist within the perfection of unity. And that's why Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden, right, to earth, because they could only exist in a place of duality. And that's exactly what happened. Additionally, the fall of humanity from sin and all that stuff really, in my mind, was a fall of spirit into form, into our three-dimensional realm of matter, right? It's sort of like from an alchemical perspective, the prima materia, right? The fall of spirit into matter. It is, the spirit, this grand spirit, this soul that we have that can roam about the cabin of the universe, right? Anywhere at any time, is now constricted in this three-dimensional world of duality, in this body of flesh and blood, okay? So why am I using the Garden of Eden as an example of symbolist philosophy? Well, first of all, everybody knows the story, right? Secondly, I think it actually is a good example because there's a lot of similarity going on there, right? Third, the person who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, Moses, was an Egyptian, and he was intimately familiar with Egyptian philosophy and religion. So I'm going to use one more example here to drive the point home concerning the netters and the fact that they are the embodiment of cosmic principles. And I'd like to talk about the netter entitled Hathor. Right? Hathor is the animal expression is modeled after a cow, but her face and ears are a literal symbol of fertility and birth. Now let's take a look, okay? Why a cow? Metaphorically speaking, a cow could be considered to be a source of divine nourishment through its milk. Here's a lovely image of Hathor, beautiful carving, and inside the ears are these two spheres, two small spheres inside her ears, sphere ears. If we take an image of the human female reproductive organs and we overlay it on Hathor's face, you can see that her ears represent the fallopian tubes, and there is an unfertilized embryo within each ear. And incredibly, her face mirrors the shape of the uterus. On a more esoteric level, Hathor represents the birth of form. In other words, from spirit into form, just like we talked about earlier. And it's funny, when I was in the Temple of Hathor, I was leaving with Sahalia, and Sahalia and I were having a conversation. I said, I don't like this temple. I felt very claustrophobic in it, and I couldn't figure out why. And she said to me, John Anthony West had the same feeling inside this temple. I was like, wow, that's pretty wild. Okay. After studying Hathor's temple and Hathor and what she represented, okay, to the ancient Egyptians and to the symbolist philosophy, I realized that I was getting claustrophobic, even though it was not a claustrophobic temple, because it's the movement of spirit into form. Let's take a look, finally, at the Temple of Luxor. So what do I consider to be the function or the purpose of the Egyptian temples? Well, first let me establish that before we delve into this massive exploration of the Temple of Luxor, that I am merely a humble student of the temple. I am not an expert, okay? There are experts out there, and you need to read their books, like John Anthony West, like R.A. Schwaller de Lubicz, of course, like NEXT, Aaron Cheek. These scholars spent their lives studying this temple. Well, I spent a lot of my life studying it too, but I don't consider myself to be an expert. Nevertheless, I'd like to read to you something that I wrote concerning this very issue, how I'm going to present the temple to you. I will attempt to present to you, to the best of my abilities, the true purpose of this enigmatic construct and its inherent correlation with the netters and human form. Even so, we will only be scratching the surface here. So I invite you to join me in this exploration of this magnificent symphony in stone, the Temple of Luxor. My belief is that the purpose of the Egyptian temples is to raise consciousness to higher levels, higher vibration, to become one with unity. Each temple contains a seed stone. What is a seed stone? Well, it's a stone that's taken from a previous temple. Once the location of the new temple is established, that stone is taken and either buried in the ground or within the lower part of the temple. It's almost like, a seed from a plant. Plant grows, creates a seed, you plant the seed, it grows another plant. Imagine that. It's thinking of the temple as an organic entity, and that's what it is. It's organic. Rene discovered through his painstaking research that the Temple of Luxor contained the same sacred proportions that comprise the human form. In my humble opinion, all of nature has the fingerprint of a creator, right? And this fingerprint is a mathematical fingerprint. If we look at the human body, it reveals a geometric proportion, a ratio that governs not only the growth of human beings, but also the growth of animals and plants. Its foundation is something called the Fibonacci sequence. The Fibonacci sequence is a sequence of numbers that eventually evolves into what is called a logarithmic spiral, a spiral. And don't kid yourself, the Egyptians were well aware of this. In fact, this mathematical ratio was used to construct many of the Egyptian temples, and of course, there's lots of this information concerning the Great Pyramid, of course. In fact, one of my favorite books, Secrets of the Great Pyramid by Peter Tompkins, has a chapter dedicated to this golden section. So our bodies are governed by this mathematical sequence called the Fibonacci sequence, or the golden ratio, the golden mean. Right? Now or the golden spiral. It's a lot of different names for it. The proportions of our bodies are manifestations of the golden spiral. Our ears are modeled after the golden spiral. Our heart muscle is modeled by the golden spiral. The bones in our hands are an expression of the golden spiral. Not only are our bodies governed by this proportion, but we are also a microcosm of the greater macrocosm, as I said before. The distance between each tooth in our mouths and the distance between each planet in our solar system are based on this proportion, which is represented by the Greek letter phi. Some people call it pi, some people call it phi. I say phi, phi, pho, fum. I smell the blood of a mathematician. By the way, phi is not a number. It is a function, an ongoing process that does not resolve to a conclusion or as an answer to an equation. It's funny, we are always looking for results when perhaps we should be looking to understand the process, right? Whoever you want to believe God is, okay, the creator is a mathematician because it's expressed in all of nature. Now, if that isn't mind-blowing enough, Renee also discovered that each section of the temple corresponds to a part of the human body, and the artifacts and hieroglyphs within that section of the temple correspond to that body as well, and certainly pay homage to the functions of the neters, the cosmic principles. Now, for those of you who have not seen the previous videos on Atlantofugians and alchemy, we cover this extensively. It's called correspondences. Everything corresponds to something else, right? Nothing is separated. And Schwaller uses a term, Renee uses a term called anthropocosmos. Anthropo meaning human, and then cosmos meaning the cosmos. In other words, we are microcosms of the greater macrocosm. Humanity is not a product of the universe, nor is it a scale model. It embodies the very essence of the universe incarnated into physical form. We are expressions of universal cosmic functions like breathing, gestation, and growth. So now that we have now that we have a basic understanding of this, right? Let's dive right into the temple and take a look at each section of the temple and how it corresponds to the human bodies and to the functions of the neters. So here we are standing before the magnificent Temple of Luxor. Before we enter the temple, I'd like to say a few things about the exterior. If we look at the Temple of Man from the upper chambers on our way down, everything looks cool, right? All the chambers are aligned and appear to follow a central axis like good little soldiers. Until we get to the Hall of Marchers. What's this about? Why such asymmetry? Essentially, there are many more examples of this asymmetry and oddities throughout the Temple of Man. And these asymmetries and oddities allow the temple to oscillate around the axes. We're going to talk about the axes a little bit more later. So you might be asking yourself, Tony G, there's another thing you've been talking about a lot, and that is polarities, right? And duality from unity, and the rupture of unity for duality. Where is it represented in the Temple of Luxor? Right at the front. If you look at those two massive wall-like structures on either side of the entryway, those are called pylons. And they actually represent duality from unity. Okay, the rupture of unity into duality. Isn't that cool? The imagery that's depicted on the pylons, the front of the pylons, depicts a very famous battle in Egyptian history. It's called the Battle of Kadesh. Now, the traditional interpretation of this is that the pharaoh is just showing off, okay, how he's defeating his enemies. However, the symbolist version of this takes a very different spin. Essentially, when you're outside the temple, you're battling the forces of darkness, okay? When you enter the temple, you are bathed in the light of higher consciousness. It's really beautiful, isn't it? Just outside the pylon, in front of the statues of Ramses II, you can see an obelisk, a single obelisk. There was a second one, there were a pair, but that was taken by the French, and it's now in Paris. And there are obelisks all over the world. They're all over the place. They've been taken from Egypt over the course of time. So now that we've looked at the outside of the temple, let's go inside. This part of the temple corresponds to the feet and the lower part of the leg, or the shin bone. Here we are in the Hall of Marchers. Now, when one enters the Temple of Man, one enters via the feet, because remember, this was the last part of the temple that was constructed. It started at the head and went all the way down to the feet. And it was constructed by Ramses II. How do we know this? Well, because there are 18 statues of Ramses, with each statue with their left foot forward. Why the left foot? Remember, we talked about how the Egyptians believed that the seat of consciousness was not the brain, but the heart. Why the heart? Well, if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. When you're upset or when you're happy, where do you feel it? Do you feel it in your brain, or do you feel it in your heart? Or in your chest? You feel it in your chest, right? In your heart. So it makes perfect sense. In fact, remember, we talked about the mummification process, and when people were mummified, all the internal organs were removed from the body, including the brain, through the nose. I guess if you're dead, it doesn't matter. But all the organs were removed and put in special jars called canopic jars, except the heart. They left the heart in the mummified body because it was the seat of consciousness. So that's why your heart's on the left side of your body. Therefore, life and movement has to do with the left leg forward. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Now, what's really mind-boggling here is that the angle of the hole, that's that angle of the axes, that skewed angle, follows the angle of the forward foot of the statue, all the 18 statues in the Hall of Martyrs. The temple itself is a representation of that movement. Remember, we've got a lot of microcosm, macrocosm stuff going on here. So the statues of Ramses represent the microcosm, right? The human being, okay? And the temple itself becomes the macrocosm. But it gets even more complex. My head's going to explode because the temple is also the microcosm to the greater macrocosm of the cosmos. Remember the word anthropocosmos that Renee talked about, meaning a human being is kind of a blueprint of the cosmos, not just physically because of the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio that's built into the temple and built into our bodies, but also because of the energies of the netters that are imbued in our bodies and that correspond with the various sections of the temple. So a very important concept concerning ancient Egyptian culture and religion is the divine triad. Essentially what you have is three netters representing three specific things, okay? We have a masculine aspect, a feminine aspect, and the result of the masculine and feminine unity, which is typically a child. In terms of the Temple of Luxor, we have Hallmun, who represents the masculine aspect, Mut, his wife, who represents the feminine aspect, and Khonsu, their child, who represents the unity, the result of the unity of masculine and feminine energies, okay? These three netters are reflected in the axes of the temple. There are three axes of the temple. We're going to get into that in more detail when we get to the Holy of Holies within the head of the temple. It's a really cool concept, and it's reflected in a lot of modern religions today. Now, we've touched on the lower part of the leg, which is represented by the Hall of Martyrs, but where the knees would be in the human body are two massive seated statues of Ramses II. As we exit the Hall of Martyrs on our way to the colonnade, in this video that I took, you can see the seated pair of colossal Ramses statues on either side we spoke about earlier. At the place where the knees will be located in the temple is a relief whose masonry deliberately dissects the two standing figures at the knees. It's as if the builders created a guide to the symbolic imagery within the temple for the initiated. There are many examples of these deliberate demarcations throughout the temple. And the carvings on the side of the statues depict a mirror image of the Nile River netter known as Hapi. Hapi has both male and female attributes. He's got breasts like a woman, and he's dressed like a man, as you can plainly see. And this can also be interpreted in an alchemical sense as a hermaphrodite. A hermaphrodite is an entity that contains both masculine and feminine properties in perfect harmony and balance. These are all unified polarities. Again, we're talking about correspondences. Everything corresponds to something, right? Isn't this mind-blowing? We can see the two Hapi figures are tying the stems of a papyrus plant and a lotus plant around what is a symbol of a human trachea, and below it, lungs. This complex image represents the union of Upper and Lower Egypt, but also symbolically the Nile River. The Nile represented the breath of life to the Egyptians. More on this later. All right, so I could go on babbling about this forever, but I'm going to stop right now because we want to get to the next section, which is known as the colonnade of Hallmun. The colonnade of Hallmun corresponds to the femur, which is the bone in the thigh. Here we are in the colonnade of Hallmun. The colonnade consists of 2 rows, 7 columns each on either side, that are shaped like papyrus plants. But the number 7 is also very important to the ancient Egyptians, according to Renee. It represents process and growth. Along the walls, on the outside of the colonnade, are depictions of the Apet festival, which was a celebration of the annual flooding of the Nile River. Why was this so important? Well, when the Nile overflowed, it left this beautiful, rich, fertile silt for the Egyptians to plant their crops. So this annual flooding was extremely important. I mean, there were no grocery stores to go to. We go to the grocery store, we pick something off the shelf. We don't even think about what's involved in gathering that food, whatever it is. Well, the Egyptians didn't have that luxury. If you weren't paying attention to the cycles of nature, if you weren't paying attention to the seasons, you starved. Okay, so this is a very important festival. Another very important aspect of the Apet festival is that it represented the renewal of kingship for the pharaoh. Besides the processions being depicted of the Apet festival, there are depictions of food and feasts and all that stuff. Well, what does this have to do with the colonnade of Hallmun and the thigh? What does it have to do with it? Well, the femur, which is the single bone in the thigh, provides support and nourishment. Well, support, of course, for the skeletal structure, because without the femur, you're going to fall apart. Okay, and nourishment, because up until adulthood, the femur, the marrow inside the femur supplies red blood cells for the rest of the body, particularly to bring oxygen to the internal organs and our tissues. So the Egyptians knew somehow that this bone had something to do with nourishment of the body, that the red blood cells were created in the marrow of the femur and it supplied nourishment to the body. A village located in southeastern France, I believe it's called Ise, has a very unique and odd crest. It's a phoenix sitting on top of a bone. What's odd about this is that it appears in the Temple of Man, in the book, and there it is. The motto of the village is the phrase, Moriendo renascor. Working on my Latin, are you impressed? Well, which means, in death I am reborn. Now, the phoenix, of course, is a perfect symbol of this, right? It's a bird born from the ashes of its former self, okay? It's really cool. Renee tells us that in man, the absolute fixed salt of his being is formed in the femur, the foundation and support of the physical body. A fixed salt is an alchemical term. Remember, Renee was an alchemist, and that has to do with the calcination or reduction of a substance to its primary essence, usually an ash or a salt. He goes on to say, through the destruction of form is when the fixed and the volatile are separated, and then they're later rejoined, as he says here. The carrier of the fixed element is paternal, that of the volatile is maternal. There is, at the same time as regeneration, a rejoining of the volatile with the fixed in a determined state. This is a nod to the basic 3 phases of the alchemical process. There's a lot more to it than that, and demonstrates the importance of the femur because, as Renee states, the femur contains the very essence or salt of our bodies. We will become perfected by the harmonic unity of the polarities within us. He takes it a step further and identifies the femur in terms of regeneration through its division into 2 bones below it. Elbows and knees are represented as moments in which Genesis, by dualizing, has created a new orientation. In the forearm, the humerus divides into radius and ulna. The femur divides into tibia and fibula. Again, we have the rupture of unity into duality within our own bodies, according to Renee, and mirrored symbolically within the Temple of Man. Wow. Yeah, that's a mouthful, right? So, dare we venture to the next part of the temple? Are you ready for more? The Peristyle Court corresponds to the abdomen, navel, stomach, and sexual organs. We now find ourselves in the massive Peristyle Court of the Temple of Man. While exploring it, he noticed there are hieroglyphs carved on the architraves of the Peristyle Court, and the architraves essentially are the huge stones on top of the columns. Because Renee could not read hieroglyphs, he enlisted the help of Alexandre Varille. If we take a look again at the overlay of the striding man, human being, over the temple, incredibly, what they discovered, precisely where the belly button would be, is the announcement of the birth of the king. So essentially we're talking about the umbilical cord, right? The belly button, the umbilical cord. So this is what it said. It is here, the true site of the birth of the king, where he passed his infancy, and from whence he departed crowned. Wow. Wow. On the outside of the court, where the spinal column would be on the opposite side, on the west side. So we had the east side, we had the navel, right, the umbilical cord. On the west side, we had the spinal column. And get this, there are reliefs depicting 13 horse-drawn chariots. When comparing the chariot scene's position with an anatomically correct skeleton, he made an amazing discovery. The 13th horse falls at the precise location of the first lumbar vertebrae. There's a series of 5 vertebrae at the lower part of the spine. It gets better. The 12 horses preceding it represented the middle part of the spinal column. This is known as the thoracic vertebrae, of which there are 12. 12 vertebrae, 12 chariots. Now, this is my own little theory, so you can take this with a grain of salt. Why chariots? I was thinking that it has to do with energy, right? The spinal column is energy. If you study meditation, one of the goals is to bring that lower energy, you know, from the sexual organs and the digestive tract, also bring that energy up through the kundalini, right, the spinal column, to achieve enlightenment, bringing that energy from the lower chakras to the higher chakras. Renee has this to say concerning the chariots and the spinal column. This is from in the Temple of Man, of course. Here we go. The marrow that runs through the 12 thoracic vertebrae penetrates the first lumbar vertebra, from which comes the bundle of lumbar and sacral nerves that terminate it. In anatomy, this place is called, are you ready? The horse's tail. Let us recall here that the horse represents the living Ammonian water. Here, the cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the marrow. That's why there are chariots. I mean, think about that. It's energy moving up the spine. As the ancient Chinese call it qi. It's qi. All right, let's get to the next section, which has to do with the heart and the lungs. This is just awesome. The hypostyle hall corresponds to the pulmonary system, which consists of the heart and the lungs. Here we are in the great hypostyle hall of the Temple of Man. In this hall, there were 32 massive columns. Apparently, holes were cut in the floor to accommodate the columns, but the columns didn't necessarily go into those holes. They were offset for some strange reason. We're going to find out why. As you can see by these photos, there's a variation in the way the flooring was cut to accommodate these massive columns. So why would somebody haphazardly place these columns? First of all, they're really heavy. So I can't imagine them cutting a hole in the floor, bringing the columns over there, placing them and going, oh, it's off by a couple of inches. Just leave it. I don't think that happened in ancient Egypt. No. So why would they be so careless in placing these things? The columns were deliberately offset to represent a very important and recurring celestial event. They were to demonstrate the phases of the moon. As you can see in this image from the Temple of Man, they provided for the offset of the columns so the phases of the moon can be properly demonstrated. Now, if this is so, why lunar symbolism? As mentioned earlier in this video, the moon controls the rise and fall of the tides, and the ancient Egyptians equated this with the rise and fall of our chest when we breathe. Now remember that mirror image of Hapi, that glyph we were looking at on the seated statues of Ramses II at the knees, and each Hapi was holding a plant that was wrapped around the trachea, and below the trachea, the lungs. And Hapi was the nectar of the Nile. So obviously the lungs are associated with water, okay, with the moon, and it's all correspondence. You see how this all corresponds? It's really so incredibly beautiful, isn't it? I mean, once you understand it, it's revealed, you know? It's revealed to us, okay? But essentially, that's what we're talking about here. The Egyptians were savvy, man. They were savvy. Now, as we travel on to the Hall of 8 columns, we can see there's something missing here. Columns. This section of the temple was associated with the heart, the masculine. Initially, it was believed that early Christians took over this place, plastered over the walls, as you can see, and painted images of the saints. However, recent scholarship has determined that when the Romans occupied this temple in the 2nd or 3rd centuries, they plastered over the walls with images not of Catholic saints, but of Roman emperors. Hey, that's what Romans do, right? They're Romans. They also added 2 Roman-style columns and an arch in the entrance to the next section of the temple. Ironically, the Hall of 8 columns became a church, which is kind of cool because it's dedicated or corresponding to the heart. So now let's move on to the next section, which actually is the head. We're finally entering the head, which has many chambers, and we're going to explore some of those chambers. The inner sanctuaries correspond to the sensory organs of the head. Welcome to the most sacred part of the Temple of Man. Of course, it's all sacred, but as we explore this, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's incredible. If the intent of the ancient Egyptians was to align specific chambers and sanctuaries to organs within the head, then we should see some sort of correspondence. And we do. Even so, the discovery of these chambers and their alignment to various organs within the head, which we will explore shortly, was incredible. One of the most profound discoveries in my mind concerned the paving stones on the floor. In fact, Rene literally states in the Temple of Man, one is struck by the apparent incoherence of the arrangement of the stones that make up this pavement. But as we discovered, there's more here than meets the eye. Oh, without a doubt. Through careful investigation, Rene found that these paving stones are not carelessly arranged, but instead had a most profound and astonishing purpose. As we can now see, the profile of a face appears on the floor of the temple. In keeping with the profile of a human taking a forward step, the temple now resonates with this addition and verifies the symbolist theory. And in terms of alignment with the sensory organs and the brain, in this image we see each chamber corresponding to a specific organ. In the following sections, we'll explore some of these chambers. We can't explore them all because the video would be 4 hours long. So let's go to what I consider to be a very important chamber of the temple. It's called the Holy of Holies. Here we are in the Holy of Holies, which is also known as the seat of the temple. Why is it known as the seat of the temple? Because it was the first part of the temple built. And remember, the Egyptians used a seed stone from a previous temple in this temple. This is where they placed it. So it's really important because this has to do with the growth of the temple over the course of time, like the growth of a human being. It's very, very significant here. In addition to that, the 3 axes of the temple were carved here, 2 of which can be seen here. Now, the temple plan followed these 3 axes without deviation over the course of its construction. Right? If there were 1 axis, it would be a pretty static building. But because there are 3 axes, the temple was alive with movement. And again, these 3 axes, as I mentioned earlier, were dedicated to the 3 netters of the divine triad of Thebes, or as they were officially known, the Theban triad. Amun, his wife Mut, and Khonsu, their child. Khonsu was the prince. So concerning these 3 axes specifically, the axis of Amun is the generating fire of the generating power of Min Amun. It passes through the entire body, animating each part of life with it. Min Amun was the netter of fertility and harvest, the embodiment of the masculine principle. So that's really important. That's the seed, all right, going through the temple and animating each part of the temple with life. The axis of Mut marks growth, alternation, movement, and of course, gestation. And of course, the axis of Khonsu, he's the prince of the temple, right? It represents the manifestation, Ra, if you will. As Rene says, specifically regarding these axes in the temple, we are dealing with a living temple, and nothing in it could or should have a cadaverous rigidity. It is this construction on 3 axes that gives movement to the entire architecture, thus creating this living state. Each of these axes has, in addition to its mystical significance, a concrete significance related to it. So we had the mystical component of the axes, and then we had, of course, the construction that was built upon this mystical component. Moving on, let's take a look at the Hall of 12 Columns, which has to do with sight and vision, the eyes. Here we are in the Hall of 12 Columns, and this corresponds to the eyes, sight, vision, also east-west symbology. The 12 columns represents 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. Interestingly, the physical correspondence has to do with the visual conduit that connects the eye to the brain. There are a bundle of 12 nerves in this conduit. I believe it's called the optic nerve. It's really interesting that there are 12 columns, right? So they must have known about that as well. Carrying this theme of day and night and east-west symbolism with some very interesting imagery that was carved into the walls of this chamber. To the ancient Egyptians, the sun moving across the sky represented renewal in the east when it rose, right? And accomplishment when it set in the west. This is depicted as some very unusual imagery in this chamber. We find that the eastern vulture is unfinished. He's unfinished because he represents renewal and new beginnings. The western vulture is finished and therefore represents completion and accomplishment. Now, in my opinion, the talons are opposites as well to indicate that they are complementary polarities like yin and yang. There cannot be one without the other. In another example of animal symbolism, during our exploration of the temple, as you can see here, this video I took, Sahalia mentioned that during one of her tours, a doctor recognized two images of a cow being tied for sacrifice that was reversed on both sides of the doorway to the Temple of 12 Columns. He believed this had to do with how the brain processes upside down and reverse images from the eyes. Now, there's so much more symbolism here in this chamber concerning animals and things like that. East-west symbology. We just don't have time to get into it because I want to get to the next section, which is probably the most sacred and important part of the temple, which is the three sanctuaries at the end of the temple. So let's get right to that. In this upper section of the temple, there are a group of chambers known collectively as the Triple Sanctuary. These were the most sacred sanctuaries within the temple, and only the highest order of Egyptian priests were permitted to enter this part of the temple. Why was it so sacred? Well, these chambers corresponded to specific organs, which we will take a look at, that define the mystical principle of the human mind. I'd like to read something that NEXT wrote concerning this, and he addresses it very eloquently here. The Triple Sanctuary corresponds to the major psychic centers in the human head, where we find the pineal gland, pituitary gland, and hypothalamus. These are the control centers responsible for mystic experience. It was the most secret and mysterious part of the temple, just as these control centers represent some of the most mysterious aspects of the human temple, our bodies. For example, the room at the far right corresponds to the pineal gland, known by its more mystical title, the third eye. The third eye, or pineal gland, is responsible for esoteric visions and higher consciousness. Again, as I stated earlier, my belief is that the purpose of the Egyptian temples is to raise consciousness to higher levels, higher vibration, to become one with unity. Now, pineal gland is known as the gateway to higher consciousness in many ancient traditions. Specifically, that can be done through meditation, through rhythmic chanting, or, as our good friend and alchemist Steve Kalick demonstrated to us, through entheogenic elixirs like the blood of Osiris or ayahuasca, or in the case of the Egyptians, it would be the blood of Osiris. Now, the central room of the Triple Sanctuary corresponds to the pituitary, which produces hormones that help to control growth, sexuality, blood pressure, and metabolism, as well as some aspects of pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding. So you can see why this chamber is so very important. I mean, these are critical functions of human consciousness, right? Now, the room at the far left, which would be closest to the front of the head when it's in profile, corresponds to the olfactory bulb, which is a receptor of our sense of smell, and is probably our most powerful sense, as I'm sure you know. I mean, who hasn't, you walk into a room, somebody's wearing a cologne or perfume that takes you back, 20, 30 years, or in my case, because I'm an old man, 50, 60 years. What other sense that we have does this? I can't think of anything that's so powerful, right? Renee tells us specifically here, among terrestrial vertebrates, the olfactory brain, which is the most primitive, has its animal form in the serpent, for which the cobra of Egypt is the typical representative, or the symbol. And of course, it should be clear to us now as to the importance of the Triple Sanctuary, these three chambers, in terms of the functionality of the human being. NEXT has another thing to say about this, and I want to read it to you because it's really, really cool. From a symbolist perspective, this section of the temple not only symbolizes the generative principles of creation, but man's direct link with a higher state of consciousness. Man, I couldn't have said that better myself. I didn't, and he did. That's why I read it to you. These three sanctuaries also correspond to the exterior of the human head. The headdress Pharaoh wears that displays the snake and the vulture, which is called the uraeus, is where these two creatures appear to emerge directly from the forehead, precisely where the third eye resides symbolically, and also where these chambers are located. The snake corresponds to masculine energy, while the vulture to feminine energy. Here, the pharaoh, as an example of a perfected human being, is transformed to higher consciousness through the temple, through these three chambers. So what's going to happen is we're going to look at a part of the temple that is not within the temple, it's outside the temple. Huh? What does that mean? We're going to get to that in a minute. Remember the diadem crown dividing the two hemispheres of the brain from Tutankhamun's tomb? In general, the left hemisphere controls speech, comprehension, arithmetic, and writing. The right hemisphere controls creativity, spatial ability, artistic and musical skills. These two hemispheres are always reacting in dualistic comparative fashion. As mentioned earlier, we're now going to go to the final part of the temple, which resides outside of the temple. It's not within the temple. That's really crazy, isn't it? Why would they do that? There's a reason. The crown of the skull, where the faculties for reasoning and discernment exist, are troublesome concerning the perfected human. Let's find out why. So why is the crown of the skull relegated to the outside of the temple? Renee gives us a clue here. A person kneeling is deprived of the limbs necessary for locomotion. He can no longer move. If this person then joins his hands, he also takes away the limbs necessary for action. He can no longer act. These actual gestures are also symbolic. They create a state of passivity and represent the voluntary abdication of personal independence, the acceptance of a superior authority. Essentially, when we pray, we're putting ourselves in a position of passivity and humility before God. We want to abandon our contentious and dualistic faculties to return to unity with the source, right? With God. John Anthony West reminds us, the temple excludes the crown of the head, the seat of intellectual faculty. The cerebral cortex dualists permits distinction and creates the illusion of separation. Here lies the crux of this critically important concept here, concerning the temple of man as a whole. Essentially, by eliminating the centers of comparison, reasoning, and ego, we may be inspired by spirit alone. Okay, we're becoming vessels of spirit, of higher consciousness. As an example, in this rather curious image, the statue holds the crown or top portion of its head in its hand. This is Saint Nicasius from the 5th century, a bishop in France. Of course, Nicasius didn't cut off the top of his skull. That would be extremely painful and not very productive. This is highly symbolic and represents exactly what Renee is addressing here, the act of yielding or becoming a vessel to higher consciousness, or in the case of Saint Nicasius, God. Remember, the temple represents the perfected human, the human being before the fall of spirit into form and the attrition of ego, discernment, and polarities. Wow, so we come to the end of this here. What I would like to say is, first of all, if you're so inspired, I strongly recommend you read all of Renee's books, okay? They're really tough to get through. I mean, certainly I hope this video has inspired you to do that. I also recommend my good friend NEXT's forthcoming book on the Temple of Man. I just can't wait to read it myself, because if it's anything like his tour or like his correspondence with people, with me, and his social media correspondence, it's going to be an incredible book with lots of insight. So I'll conclude this video with a quote from Renee that sums it all up. The whole point is to activate the higher faculties and not to be content with the deceptive means of cerebral intelligence. Essentially, that is exactly what happened to me on my trip to Egypt. I was looking to satisfy my cerebral intelligence, but Egypt said to me, no, this is a spiritual journey, and instead created a spiritual intelligence within me, if you will. Renee calls this the intelligence of the heart, and indeed, I think I finally understand what he's talking about. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you've enjoyed it to the point where you're going to subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching. I know this was a really long video, but I hope it was worth it. Have a great time, be safe, and the next videos, we go back to Atalanta Fugians in the alchemical realm.